Good morning. I recently received the following email from a constituent of mine in Calgary, Lougheed. Michael wrote the following, quotes, "I have not had a full-time job in over 2 years. I have a wife and kids, no health or dental coverage, no cash left, and zero RRSP or pension funds, as I've had to drain this out just to survive. I can't compete for roles in my professional field of project controls, as there is no capital investment at all and zero opportunity to change career paths when hundreds of people with experience apply to every position. Over half of our people are broke and looking at poverty and economic ruin in the new normal," unquote. That is the reality being lived today by tens and tens of thousands of Albertans and other Canadians across the country. That is a reality that yesterday's throne speech and address from the Prime Minister completely failed to recognize, to acknowledge, or to act on. Yesterday's throne speech included 6,783 words. Not one of them was about the largest industry sector in the Canadian economy. Not one of them mentioned our oil and gas sector, which helped to pull Canada through the last global recession. Not one word recognizing the crisis in that sector and in energy-producing provinces like Alberta. Not one word about fairness in the Federation, about Western alienation, about creating real jobs right now as the central focus of governments across Canada. Last week, I was in Ottawa with premiers representing a consensus of all 13 provinces and territories, calling on the federal government in the throne speech to focus on two key priorities, on health and the economy and jobs. We also asked for action to show fairness in the Federation through reform of the Fiscal Stabilization Program. These issues were not addressed in yesterday's throne speech. There was space for every bright, shiny object, every possible political distraction. Kooky academic theories like intersectionality found their way into yesterday's throne speech, but not one word about health transfers for the provinces that are carrying 80% of the costs as our population ages and we cope with the pandemic. Yesterday's throne speech presented endless policies that would actually further hammer the largest sector of the Canadian economy, like the clean fuel standards. No recognition that what the federal government must do at this point is first to do no harm. All we are asking of the Government of Canada is to let this province and our resource industries to get off their knees, to get back onto our feet during this, the largest economic contraction since the Great Depression. Yesterday's speech reflected a total lack of understanding about the economic crisis through which we are living as a country. It was a fantasy plan for a mythical country that only exists apparently in the minds of Ottawa Liberals and like-minded Laurentian elites, that forgets about the regions and the resource workers who have been the motor of Canadian prosperity in recent decades. The oil and gas industry, the largest export industry of the Canadian economy, typically exporting $100 billion of value every year. We're never going to export $100 billion or a fraction of that in wind and solar generated electricity. This is the largest export industry that is critical to our balance of payment, to our national wealth. It generates 20% of the Government of Canada's revenues. It employs 500,000 Canadians. The energy industry more broadly it supports 800,000 jobs directly and indirectly. And all we saw yesterday was a repetition of a litany of policies that would further damage that industry at a time of critical need. Let us remember that the Canadian energy sector has been the great engine of social mobility in this country during a time of economic change in recent decades, when many workers in other parts of the country didn't have the benefit of post-secondary education, but had good jobs, lost those jobs in the traditional manufacturing sector, in the East Coast fishery, in the BC forestry, and in other industries, and tens, hundreds of thousands of them moved to Alberta for opportunity over the past 4 decades, making good incomes, being able to take care of their families, and in many cases, being able to start new businesses and enjoy the thrill of opportunity. It is important that we remember, during the global financial crisis in 2007, 8, and 9, the last major global economic downturn, the Canadian energy sector pulled this country through that crisis with less damage than any other major developed economy. And it was in part thanks to the generous transfers emanated by the responsible development of our resources here that we have not only been able to support the economy of other parts of the country, but also the social programs, the healthcare, the infrastructure, and education, with a net fiscal contribution of over $630 billion coming from Albertans through their federal taxes since 1960, and even in recent tough years, an average net annual fiscal contribution of $20 billion a year. A strong Canada needs a strong Alberta, and Alberta was not recognized in yesterday's throne speech with the one passing reference about effectively phasing out the energy sector. Yesterday's throne speech outlined future tax incentives for companies that invest in net zero carbon technology, but zero reference to the companies that are actually doing the major heavy lifting and investing in green technology with the support of Alberta's government. That is our cutting-edge oil and gas companies that are doing remarkable things to reduce carbon intensity and to show real practical environmental progress as opposed to costly pie-in-the-sky schemes. But it's not just about oil and gas. It's about the damage being inflicted to resource industries broadly and to the women and men who work in them. The federal bill C-69, no, we have been pleading with the federal government to go back to the drawing board, to listen to virtually every industry group in the country, to listen to the Senate of Canada, and to make major amendments that undo the damage and uncertainty created by the No More Pipelines law. They've disregarded that, and in the last few months, we have seen the federal government reach into our provincial jurisdiction to create great investor uncertainty by committing to federal environmental reviews on 3 mines here in Alberta that had been under provincial environmental jurisdictional authority. And that is the canary in the coal mine of where they are going to be going in terms of disrupting the Canadian mining industry. A commitment in yesterday's throne speech to sterilize 25% of the landmass in Canada. We here in Alberta are proud of our record of protecting conservation areas within our province. But the implications for the forestry industry and the women and men who work in it of a federal intervention to sterilize enormous amounts of the forestable land in this province are potentially devastating, and by the way, would be counterproductive in terms of properly managing our forests to protect the global environment. The Clean Fuel Standard commitment in the legislation, in the throne speech yesterday, here our government is doing everything we humanly can to attract new investment, to create jobs in this province through diversification and value-add projects, like, for example, major petrochemical projects and expansion of fertilizer plants in this province to help produce greater agricultural yields here and around the world. We've been in conversations with global companies, some of them Canadian, some of them from abroad, who have been looking at collectively tens of billions of dollars of capital investment that would create tens of thousands of construction jobs and thousands of high-paying operating jobs in areas like petrochemicals and fertilizer production. But all of those companies are now telling us that those potential investments would be jeopardized if the federal government proceeds with the current policy direction on clean fuel standards and other issues reiterated in yesterday's throne speech. Those are trade-exposed industries. If we don't produce petrochemical products in Alberta, if we don't produce fertilizers here, they will be produced elsewhere to support global demand. Just like our energy sector, if we don't produce those products here, then we will be giving a monopoly to OPEC dictatorships. You know, it's important for governments to pivot. I was a member of Stephen Harper's government that didn't believe, as a matter of political philosophy, in protecting or intervening to support individual sectors or companies. And yet, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, we saw the potential total collapse of the Canadian automobile manufacturing sector that could have led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs in central Canada and the flight of the entire automotive industry to the United States because of American support. And so I recall the Conservative Harper government made the difficult, counterintuitive decision to pivot away from what our natural political instinct would have been to provide short-term support, to build a bridge so the auto industry could survive and protect hundreds of thousands of good-paying Canadian manufacturing jobs. The point is, yesterday, the Government of Canada had an opportunity to pivot to the reality of the largest global economic contraction since the 1930s and the reality of the largest decline in energy prices in history, in absolute terms, in a country where that is the largest sector of the economy. They failed to pivot. That throne speech was filled with, as I say, endless distractions and bright, shiny objects, and was not focused on the central imperative that should unite leaders across partisan and geographic lines, which is protecting lives and livelihoods, as the Premier said last week. Finally, yesterday's throne speech represented a full frontal attack on Canadian federalism, on the Constitution of Canada, on provincial jurisdiction. There are more policies that would invade provincial jurisdiction than I could count. And a number of policies that embedded in that throne speech and in the federal government's program, which would constitute, in our view, de facto constitutional amendments without actually going through the constitutional amendment formula. These are very serious issues about the life of the Canadian Federation. I regret that the federal government so spectacularly failed the mark yesterday. I will be speaking with my colleagues, the premiers of the other provinces and territories, later today about the speech from the throne and the Prime Minister's address, and we'll be issuing a communiqué today or tomorrow collectively. I know that many of my provincial colleagues share many aspects of our disappointment. Alberta will continue to work with our allies across the country to focus on lives and livelihoods, to focus on health care and jobs in the economy. We will continue to use every tool at our disposal to defend the vital economic interests of our province, just as we are doing this week at the Supreme Court, supporting our appeal on the carbon tax reference, a issue that we won on a 4-1 decision at the Alberta Court of Appeal. And next week we expect to be back at that court defending Alberta jobs and exclusive constitutional jurisdiction to regulate the production of resources through our constitutional reference on the federal No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69. Regrettably, the federal government proceeds with the legislative agenda outlined yesterday. There will be many more constitutional challenges, and I have every expectation that other provinces will be joining us in those. With that, I'm happy to take your questions.
All right. Just before we get started, I want to remind everybody on the line that we have a couple of people who are interested in asking questions. So just keep in mind that there are folks waiting behind you as you ask questions. With that, operator, can you please put through the first caller?
First is Rick Bell with the Calgary Sun. Go ahead, Rick.
Good morning, Premier. With this latest bad news from Ottawa, or maybe I should say predictable bad news, do you think it's time to change your strategy? Because it doesn't seem to be that whatever strategy Alberta is employing, it's not really working. So is it time to change strategy? And apart from talking to the premiers and having consulting with your allies, what is Alberta going to do so that there is that pivot, there is that turnaround?
Well, Rick,
from Ottawa.
Yeah. Rick will constantly assess our strategy to have the most effective fight-back strategy to defend our vital economic interests, just as we are doing. And part of this, Rick, is a message to the federal government, as I said last week, that we're ready to work together. I said this to Justin Trudeau the day after our Alberta election last year. We're ready to find common ground, and on some issues we have, on an equivalency agreement for major emitters, which led to our big announcement this week that will create thousands of jobs through the industry levy, the agreement on methane regulations, and so in some areas, we've been able to find some common ground. But on the big picture, we're now 17 months as a government here in Alberta. We are now almost a year since Mr. Trudeau openly campaigned against Alberta and our oil and gas sector in the last campaign, with repeated pleas to understand how we can ensure a vital future for our largest industry, and they still have not come back to us with an answer for that question. You know, it was originally the 100 megaton cap, and I indicated we were prepared to talk about that and to work with the federal government. And then it became legislating Paris, and then it became legislating more than Paris, and then it became, now it's about legislating net zero, without talking to seriously, to the province or the industry that is most important in these issues, without being willing to step up and help us with technologies that will reduce the environmental impact and the carbon output of those industries. So the plea has been to work with us, and if they won't, then we're going to have to use every tool that we can to defend ourselves. And that is why we're suing them over the carbon tax, why we're suing them over Bill C-69. Part of our strategy consistently has been to demonstrate alliances across the country. I reiterate my appreciation for other provinces that have had our back, as expressed in a demand for fiscal fairness last week. And we will continue to push for implementation of the Fair Deal recommendations, including the referendum on equalization next year, including serious work on a potential Alberta pension plan, an Alberta provincial police force. We will be appointing our own Alberta Chief Firearms Officer, and we have created our own Alberta Parole Board. There are over 24 items that we'll be pursuing to assert a stronger Alberta, partly as a response to the attitude of this federal government.
All right, perfect. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Tyler Dawson with the National Post. Go ahead, Tyler.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask about the hint of an accelerated national pharmacare, universal pharmacare plan, I should say, and something to do with daycare. If I recall, one of the commitments of the Fair Deal panel was to opt out of federal cost-sharing programs with a full refund. If those two measures come forward, will the UCP government attempt to opt out of them?
Certainly on pharmacare, yes. That's our position, the position of many other provinces. We already have a pharmacare support here. We would expect a equivalent cash transfer. Look, we don't need politicians and bureaucrats in Ottawa micromanaging what our healthcare priorities are across the Federation. All I can say is thank goodness the pandemic response has been managed capably by provinces that are on the ground, as opposed to distant Ottawa that got a great deal wrong about COVID at the very beginning. That's the same federal government that lectured us that it would be politically incorrect to close borders from COVID hotspots. That one decision alone of the federal government repeating the advice of the People's Republic of China and the World Health Organization is what brought COVID to Canada. The same federal government that repeated denials of evidence of human-to-human transmission of COVID-19 in January and February of this year. That was well behind Alberta, for example, in ordering personal protective equipment and so much more. So I think that the last 7 months have been an object lesson about why provinces are best placed to manage healthcare. Here in Alberta, we have a particularly serious mental health crisis to which our provincial government has devoted over $200 million in additional resources. Some provinces have quite strong pharmacare programs, others have almost none. Other provinces have much older populations and unique healthcare challenges. So the right solution is the one recommended unanimously by the 13 provinces and territories last week, which is an increase in federal transfers for healthcare to the provinces so that we can address the needs on the ground, the needs of our local populations, rather than politicians and bureaucrats thousands of kilometers from here dictating to us what's most important. On childcare, as you know, we have worked out programs with the federal government in the past 15 years, 20 years on that. An expanded version of that was just announced 2 days ago. So we would wait and see. But what concerns us is there's an intimation in yesterday's throne speech about all sorts of new national standards, legislating in areas of provincial jurisdiction, and I predict that that will not be well received by the premiers in our conversation later today.
Thank you. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Chris F. with CTV Calgary. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Premier, there's a lot of businesses, and the chambers from both Edmonton and Calgary yesterday said they were pleased with the throne speech. They're glad mainly that wage subsidy is continuing. So do you think it's outside of the energy industry? And even then, within the energy industry, some companies said they're relying on that wage subsidy. Do you think you're speaking for the whole province with this criticism? Because a lot of people seem to support the federal government's intervention right now when it comes to wages.
Look, undoubtedly, out of 6,700 words, I think that's probably the longest throne speech in history, 6,800 words, there will be some individual things that we support, and we acknowledge, as I did in Ottawa last week, and as I've done throughout the last 7 months, that we have worked with the Government of Canada on various policies. We called in this province, for example, for the wage subsidy. So there have been areas of policy agreement. My message here today is that we are facing the most serious economic crisis here since the 1930s. Albertans aren't seeking bailouts and subsidies. What we are asking the Government of Canada to do is no harm. First, do no harm to the resource industries that are the backbone, not just of the Alberta economy, but the Canadian economy. And there was zero recognition of that imperative in yesterday's throne speech. To the contrary, there was a recommitment to a series of policies that, if implemented, would do further damage to industries that are struggling to survive, not just oil and gas, but I pointed out many areas of manufacturing, forestry, the diversification efforts in petrochemicals and fertilizers in Alberta, and so much more. So I'm not here to say there was nothing that we support that was outlined in yesterday's throne speech, but in a throne speech that large, there seem to be countless priorities except a realistic plan to bring back investment in our largest sectors to create real jobs.
Okay, thank you. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is David Staples with the Edmonton Journal. Go ahead, David.
Hi, Premier. In the throne speech, they mentioned a plan for a 50% tax reduction for companies involved in creating zero-emission products, part of their big plan to get 1 million jobs. So what do you think of that tax break to those kinds of companies as opposed to help for the oil patch that didn't come? And how close do you think they're going to get to getting 1 million jobs, which would be getting back to previous levels of employment. How close do you think they're going to get to that with the plan they
Yeah.
put forward?
David, remind me, they committed to do that over how many years, over what period of time?
They made no time commitment
Right.
to the 1 million jobs.
Well, then,
which is up in the air.
then it's basically a nice political talking point. Over time, the economy will return to growth, and with any growth in a country of coming on 40 million people, eventually 1 million jobs will be created. The question is how many people leave the labor market altogether, and so it's basically a statement of reality that at some point there will be economic growth, and over some period of time, you can count that number of jobs that will be created. But on your first question, look, I addressed this in my opening remarks, that this 50% reduction in the corporate tax rate, I think, is what they proposed in the throne speech for companies that deliver net zero technologies. I'm paraphrasing. It once again appears to exclude the companies that are most important in reducing emissions, and that is Canadian oil and gas companies. Because we acknowledge that while it is the largest sector of the Canadian economy, the largest export industry, the biggest creator of jobs, the largest payer of taxes, it also creates the largest greenhouse gas emissions. And that is a real challenge, a challenge that the industry could not be taking more seriously. As you know, a number of the upstream oil and gas companies have committed as a matter of corporate policy to achieving an aspirational net zero target by 2050. But it's equally clear that none of them would benefit from that kind of federal tax cut, the way they worded that yesterday. And this is the point. We've been pleading with them, work with Alberta and the industry to accelerate technologies that will dramatically continue the reduction of GHG emissions from our energy sector. We gave a very good example of what some of those projects could be 2 days ago with our big announcement about the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Fund. This was the first province in Canada, the first jurisdiction in North America, I believe, to put a price on carbon emissions for major emitters. In Alberta, currently, the TIER plan. And our point is, if they really are focused on environmental progress, reducing emissions, while preserving and creating jobs, not just maintaining the current level of production capacity for Alberta oil and gas, but to ensure a future for additional production, additional investment, and additional jobs, then work with us, sit down with us. With the seemingly infinite fiscal resources the federal government is spending right now on all sorts of different priorities, if environment and jobs is the priority, here is where you can get the biggest bang for the buck. So that would be, and if instead they effectively penalize the energy companies by limiting those kinds of incentives only to other sectors, what message does it send about the Government of Canada's support for the reducing emissions in the sector where that is most important? So I think it's actually completely backwards. I mean, I think large sections of this speech read like they were written by these former staffers in the Government of Canada who used to work for the Tides Foundation and other organizations, other special interest groups. And I think some of those folks see the current crisis as an opportunity to further damage the largest sector of Canada's economy, and that's a great shame.
Right. I think we only have time for about 2 more callers. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Andrew Lawton with True North. Go ahead, Andrew.
Good morning, Premier. You mentioned earlier on that your disagreements with this throne speech aren't just political, that you think there's been an assault on federalism and a number of unconstitutional policies that have been championed. My question is, if the Prime Minister and the government proceed as announced in the throne speech yesterday, Are there future lawsuits against them that you can anticipate based on the policies that they've proposed that you think are not constitutional?
Absolutely, undoubtedly. We'll be at the Alberta Appeal Court next month for oral arguments on our constitutional challenge of the federal No More Pipelines Law Bill C-69. We are being supported in that by a number of other provinces, including Quebec. We are right now, of course, as you know, carbon tax reference at the Supreme Court, where we are supported by Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec. I can see if they go in the direction they articulated in yesterday's throne speech, we will go to the wall to defend the Canadian Constitution. And this is, Andrew, this is something I've tried to articulate to people in central Canada. Albertans, we're not the caricature of kind of inward-looking provincialists. We are big Canadians. We believe in the promise of the economic union. Our province has done more than any other to advance the cause of free trade, of knocking down barriers to trade and mobility within Canada. We are proud to have contributed over $600 billion net to the rest of the country when times were good here and bad elsewhere. We are proud to have helped to bring the country through the global financial crisis of a decade ago relatively unscathed. We are proud to have welcomed hundreds of thousands of Canadians who went from poverty in their home provinces to opportunity in Alberta. We are big Canadians, but that means a federation where the federal government respects how the Constitution was originally designed. And yesterday was a complete inversion of the original vision of the Federation with the federal government. I think compared to the administration of Pierre Trudeau, for example, in the 1970s, that I mean, in terms of respecting provincial jurisdiction, the first Trudeau government in the 1970s was like a walk in the park compared to the gross interference in the exclusive jurisdiction of provinces. And I know, by the way, Andrew, I know a lot of this just sounds like political science gobbledygook and legal disputes, federal provincial wrangling is probably how a lot of people see it. I'm going to go back to Michael's email that I started with. This affects real people's real lives, jobs. We've got 3 mines in Alberta right now, the future of which is potentially jeopardized because the government of Canada is using Bill C-69 to interfere in our constitutional jurisdiction over environmental assessment of projects of that nature. And so the life of those communities is jeopardized. Thousands of workers and their families, their ability to put food on the table. So this is not just some academic dispute. This is about our ability to ensure a future for families in this province.
Operator, can you please put through the last caller?
Our final question is from Janet French with CBC. Go ahead, Janet.
Hey, thanks for taking my question. I mean, a lot of your position is based on, the message you've repeated before about the global demand for Alberta oil and gas increasing. But we've seen some moves in the past week or so, looking at Shell saying they're moving away from oil and gas towards renewables and power. We've seen the governor of California say he wants all new car sales to be non-gas and light trucks by 2035. How does this affect your conviction that the global demand for oil and gas is going to continue to rise, or Alberta oil and gas?
Well, first of all, the transportation sector is not where most oil is consumed. Secondly, if you really think that the billion people in India who desperately want to move to a higher standard of living are all going to be driving Teslas 15 years from now, then you're disconnected from reality. That is to say, there are billions of people around the world living in extreme energy poverty. They don't have the luxury of repeating all of these kind of California-style pieties. They want to stop burning cow dung. They want to be able to electrify their homes. They want to have affordable and reliable energy through much of Asia, Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere, where the vast majority of the world's population lives. And so that is why, in part, every major expert in energy consumption projects that there will be substantial consumption and demand for oil and gas for decades to come. The International Energy Agency, the leading global think tank on these issues, their standard projection has been a 10% growth. This is pre-COVID projection in global consumption of oil and gas demand by 2040, going from 100 to 110 million barrels per day. But they have also put out their most bearish scenario, which they would call their fully Paris compliant scenario, which would project about 75 million barrels per day of consumption of oil and gas by 2040, which would be about a 25% decline from pre-COVID levels. But it's still a heck of a lot of energy. And so it's absolutely clear in the real world, a modern industrial economy with the vast majority of the world's population living in energy poverty, in the real world where you can't fuel airplanes, for example, or produce petrochemical products with good wishes, in that real world, there will be tens and tens of millions of barrels of oil consumed in 2040 and beyond. The only question then is who will supply. But Janet, you seem to have missed the point. This is not just about that sector. I have spent an enormous amount of time, I and other senior people in the government of Alberta, doing everything possible to attract huge petrochemical projects that would represent, each one of them, over $10 billion of capital investment, each one of them, thousands of good-paying construction jobs up front, and thousands of operating jobs thereafter, as part of our effort to diversify Alberta's economy, to turn our low-cost natural gas feedstock into industrial products that the world demands, products that will either be produced here or produced in jurisdictions with lower environmental standards. And when I talk to them, those companies say, you've done all the right things. Thank you for the cut in the business tax rate. Thank you for giving municipalities like the industrial heartland the flexibility to offer municipal property tax relief. Thank you for working with us on red tape reduction. Thank you for working with us on labor force development in the skilled trades. Thank you for giving us concierge service. Thank you for reaching out to us to the Middle East, to the U.S. Gulf. You are on our list of the top of our list for potential major petrochemical investments, but your federal government is now talking about a clean fuel standard that would massively increase the cost of feedstock. So why would we go to Alberta? Why wouldn't we just do this in Texas or Louisiana or in some developing country? They say to us, your federal government is now talking about banning single-use plastics. Is that really the top priority of Canadians during the largest economic contraction since the 1930s? They tell me that policy creates uncertainty. Maybe you instead will go to a jurisdiction that's not doing that. So, I'm sorry, Janet, this is not just about oil and gas. This is about core segments of our economy. This is about our efforts to diversify. This is about value added. Same applies. I was on the phone recently with a major international fertilizer company. They went down the list of our open for business policies, and we're extremely complimentary, and said that this is one of the best governments we've ever had to work with. And we are seriously interested in major additional capital job creating investments, but the federal clean fuel standards jeopardizes that. If they proceed as they intend, we're looking at it instead moving that investment and those jobs somewhere else. That's not about oil and gas. It's about value added, manufacturing, agriculture, diversification. these mines I'm talking about, the federal government suddenly dropping in after having decided that these projects were under provincial jurisdiction and suddenly creating great uncertainty for the investors and the workers who depend on them. So this is much broader. And I'll just close with this point. Yesterday's throne speech implied, if all of these policy good intentions were to be implemented, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of new federal spending. The question is, how are we going to pay for that? We need to pay for it by increasing economic growth, which will not happen unless we bring investment back to this country. And we will not generate levels of economic growth to support that scale of government spending by turning our back on the resource industries and related sectors that have been the key pillars of the Canadian economy. And so this is the message I'll be taking to my provincial colleagues later on this morning. Thank you very much.